Today's episode is with Andy King, who's an exercise physiologist at the Australian Catholic University. And his favourite area of research is in fueling for endurance sport. And what I wanted to get Andy on today for was to explain to you all about the hydrogel technology that we're seeing in products like Maurten and the SIS Beta Fuel. And he's really the one with his finger on the pulse when it comes to this stuff. He's co-authored a paper back in 2020 that gave a good little summary about where the research is at for endurance performance in this space. Do hydrogels improve performance or not? So I hope you really love this discussion as much as I did. And listen into the end for the biggest take home of whether hydrogels are worth it or not.
Welcome to the Triathlon Nutrition Academy podcast, the show designed to serve you up evidence-based sports nutrition advice from the experts. Hi, I'm your host Taryn, accredited practicing dietitian, advanced sports dietitian, and founder of Dietitian Approved. Listen as I break down the latest evidence to give you practical, easy to digest strategies to train hard, recover faster, and perform at your best. You have so much potential, and I want to help you unlock that with the power of nutrition. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the podcast, Andy.
Great, thanks for having me on.
I'm really excited to talk to you today. I've been looking forward to picking your brain for a long time, really. But what I wanted to get your insight on today is the evidence behind hydrogels. And you're the perfect person to talk about it because you've done the research in most of the papers to date around whether it does affect endurance performance or not. Like, I can explain to people what hydrogels are, but let's get the word from the horse's mouth from the researcher himself about what is the go with hydrogels. So thank you for joining me.
No probs.
So let's get started firstly by explaining to people what hydrogels actually are.
It's not a massive difference, I guess, from what people would typically think of as a carbohydrate drink. So you might be a cyclist, a runner, triathlete, swimmer, whatever, and there's a million products on the market to get your carbs up for race day, training day. They come in drinks, gels, solid foods, whatever, and basically they all are designed to do the same thing, which is to deliver sugar through your stomach, through your intestine, into your bloodstream, and ultimately to your muscle that's working hard for your event. And the hydrogel is a newish product by a company called Maurten out of Sweden that effectively does the same thing to deliver that carbohydrate. It started off just as a drink. They now have a gel product as well, just to confuse people with gel and hydrogel. And all it is essentially the same ingredients, so sugar, water, and two other ingredients. One of those is pectin, which is polysaccharide sugar type substance that you might have heard of if you're a keen baker. It's used in jam making. And another one which is called alginate, which is derived from seaweed, of all things. And both of those are what we term biopolymers, and they're just chains of molecules that they just mixed in with the carbohydrate solution. You drink it, it goes down as a drink. And on the contact with the extremely low pH, so high acidity in your stomach, it gelates and it forms this kind of thick, viscous substance, which is then the hydrogel, if you like. And that idea they come up with comes from the medical bioresearch field. So hydrogels are commonly used in things like drug delivery and wound healing because of their low toxicity and ability to deliver drugs or other chemicals to sites within the body. So Maurten developed this product that they got an awful lot of early marketing success with.
It was originally developed for that 2-hour marathon attempt, is that right?
Well, it was developed in conjunction around the same time, and that was probably the first big project that really kind of thrust it into the limelight, and people were like, oh, what's Maurten, and what's it doing, and what's a hydrogel? And they had an awful lot of support from some seriously good endurance athletes. And their first sort of evidence that came through was that anecdote. As you'll well know, sometimes the research needs to be led by the field, and that was one of the cases of that, really, where athletes were saying they loved it, purely really from a sense of the GI, the gastrointestinal handling of it.
And then it became commercially available. It was something that was a bit DL on the down low for a while, and then now it's everywhere because it's the race nutrition on course for Ironman events at the moment. So everyone's kind of hearing about it because the sports drink is on the bike and you've got the gels on the run.
Yeah, it's doing really well, and they're a growing company, and they're a nice company actually to deal with. And one of my former students actually works for Maurten now, who was
there you go.
author of one of the papers I'm sure we'll get onto soon.
And so have SIS borrowed or stolen that technology to create the beta fuel? Do you know?
I actually initially thought that they had, but no, it's just Maurten's proprietary product, and they have a serious number of patents out to protect that intellectual property, I think. So yeah, it's just theirs. It's not impossible to make it yourself. We've done that. Josh did that in the lab. I'm not sure I'd give it a go unless I came from a particularly good engineering or biology background. I don't think you'll get it quite right.
So what's the SIS formula then? Is it their own version of a hydrogel?
I think it's just an amped up carb mix, talking about what they're saying is the correct ratio of different sugars in the drink and caffeine, I think, but I'm sure someone can correct me on that. I think once you get down to different carb products on the market, they become much of a muchness, and you kind of just need to hit the big ticks first and foremost, which is where most people fall into.
Why hydrogel? Like, how does it actually work to deliver better fuel or be absorbed better? How does it actually work once it's in our stomach?
The theory, I guess, is there. We're just waiting on the evidence to kind of come through to show that it's working in the exercise context. And there's a research led by Sean Soothall, if you want to look up some of his work, that kind of describes it really nicely. But the idea is that once that hydrogel forms in the stomach, so the alginate and the pectin kind of form that biopolymer hydrogel, the carbs in the drink get encapsulated within that mixture, forms one kind of consistent gel-like lump in the stomach, and that moves into the intestine. And the thought is that it moves through quicker, so gastric emptying is increased and the delivery of the carb mixture to the intestine is quicker. And then once the hydrogel is sitting in the intestine, the pH is higher, and so the hydrogel mixture from the alginate and the pectin breaks down, releasing the carbohydrate. Now, this is sort of where it gets a little bit technical if we want, but whether gastric emptying increasing is enough to deliver more carbs, ultimately we're talking about to the blood and the muscle, kind of really remains to be seen. And go back sort of to the early 90s, some really awesome research on gastric emptying and carb drinks. And there's kind of this sweet spot where you can kind of keep adding carbs into a drink and you don't really affect gastric emptying. And then you sort of hit this point of energy content and or osmolality, which is kind of like the molecular concentration, if you like. And it starts to drop off. And so you think, okay, gastric emptying's reduced. That sounds bad. Let's hold back. But then actually the more carb that goes in the drink, you're still getting more carbs through. Do you know what I mean? The whole rate and volume might be slower, but the concentration is higher. And so I'm kind of not utterly convinced yet that just increasing gastric emptying alone is enough, because we know really that the major rate limiting step to getting carbs through into the bloodstream and into the muscle is the gut.
So you said it was quicker, but how fast? Do we know how many grams per minute gets absorbed, or do we know what the rate is comparatively to not a hydrogel? Do we know that yet?
Yeah, if you look at one of Sean's studies, they just did a resting study, which shouldn't really affect gastric emptying too much. And they showed that a encapsulated hydrogel mixture went through the stomach about 40% quicker than a standard carbohydrate mixture with exactly the same carb content in it.
Crazy. So does it mean that it's moving from the stomach to the duodenum into the small intestine 40% faster?
It means that there's about a 40% increase in volume being delivered into the intestine. Yeah.
And is that problematic?
It really depends on where the source of people's gastrointestinal distress comes from when they're exercising. And from what I've seen, really from having done this with runners and cyclists in the field, it's kind of different for everyone. Some people struggle with really lower GI issues. Some people sort of early intestine issues, and some people just stomach contents, which would be very upper GI, is a real problem. Classic scientist's answer, isn't it? There's no one size fits all kind of message we can give people. So is it a problem? No, if anything, it should be a benefit. If gastric emptying is going to be a bottleneck at all, which I don't really think it is, then an increased delivery to the intestine should be good. The problem, and this is where the theory is good and the evidence I'm sure will emerge, is that if we increase gastric emptying, we're doing something with the receptors that line the gut, the enteroendocrine cells, which provide feedback via the brain to the stomach to increase or decrease gastric emptying. And so somewhere we'd be pretty certain that the hydrogel is doing something to manipulate the signal there, leading to that increase in what's coming out of the stomach. And then as the carbohydrates are released in the intestine from the hydrogel, then really the rate limiting step goes back to being the transport from the intestinal lumen through the wall and into the bloodstream.
So somebody would still have to do gut training to be able to absorb more nutrition if that rate limiter is those transporters, the glucose and fructose transporters.
I think we've been pretty certain that the gut's the rate limiting issue for getting carbs through for quite a while now. And yeah, you mentioned gut training, and there's some pretty good evidence to show that that does work good in people who are going to consume a high volume of carbohydrates. So you sort of think of your elite endurance athletes. If you're not taking that much, it's not going to make a big issue. And likewise, if you do have GI complaints with carbohydrate during training, then a gut training protocol is probably going to be quite useful. But yeah, once the hydrogel is in the gut, the carbs are released, we're kind of back to the same bottleneck that was there before. So if that is going to be, or that is a problem for an individual, then I'm not entirely sure that then the hydrogel has given you much extra boost.
And are there any negatives then to using a hydrogel versus a non-hydrogel product?
Not that I think anyone's come across, no. You could potentially speculate that breakdown in the gut could provide more carbohydrate to the intestinal wall quicker. But no, that's not been reported. And actually, you'll probably see the opposite a bit, that the anecdotal evidence and the research evidence on the symptoms of GI distress are slightly better with the hydrogel versus a normal drink, say.
And perhaps people that have more upper GI issues, like you said earlier, rather than the lower GI.
Yeah, and again, I think that's something that we've got to get a lot hotter at being able to measure in the lab. It's very subjective. There aren't many great tools out there. There's one being and just been developed at Monash University here in Melbourne, which is probably the best tool we've got so far at trying to capture that information. It's pretty hard to work out what bit's sore. You know, think of your 26 feet of intestine in such a small part of your body. People can't differentiate between the stomach or the upper intestine or lower intestine particularly easily. So yeah, we need good tools.
Yeah, totally. That's a good summary of what a hydrogel is, and we now know the products that you can get a hydrogel in. The reason why I wanted to talk to you today was because in 2020, you published a review of all the papers that have been published to date, back then a couple of years ago, and there was 6 at that time, where they tested hydrogels to see if there was any benefit to performance for an endurance exercise. Can you talk me through those studies, but also like what's the outcome of that research? Looking at everything today, are hydrogels better for endurance performance or not?
Yeah, so quick answer would be no. At that point in 2020, it's 6 studies, there were no performance differences. The studies were quite varied, which is a problem in the carbohydrate exercise literature as a whole. That sort of issue comes from there being a real range of exercise modalities that people use. So cycling, running, cross-country skiing was even one of the studies in our review. The exercise intensity, the training status, how well trained the participants are, the type of carbohydrate they use, the dose of carbohydrate they use. It sort of gets quite tricky to compare too much between the studies. But yeah, the universal finding was that it didn't improve performance across most of the studies in cycling, a couple in running and one in skiing.
And across male and females too, which was nice to see.
Yeah, 2 of the studies had a mixture of males and females, which is definitely an emerging trend, sadly, so late in the literature. I don't think you'd sort of necessarily expect to see too many differences between males and females with exogenous carbohydrate feeding studies, but we know that there are big metabolic differences and training differences, so we absolutely need to be sure of that and include more females in our studies.
Couldn't agree more. So the summary of that review was hydrogels don't improve performance. And there's been a couple of studies since that time. Have they shown any differences or advantages to taking a hydrogel for performance?
Yeah, so a couple of studies since, and they're probably the 2 better studies, or more thorough, I should say. There was nothing wrong with the 6 studies in the initial review. They were well-conducted studies by reputable labs who have done this sort of work before. I think in the early days of research, people sort of do slightly more simple studies and then things moved on. So one of the studies actually measured the exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, so the amount of the carbohydrate that was in the drink or in the hydrogel that is burnt during exercise. It's just slightly unfortunate. They did a dose kind of step up, and at the low dose, they compared it to a normal carb drink compared to hydrogel, I should say. And at the high dose, they didn't. There were no differences at the lower, but at the higher, they kind of saw this bigger increase in exogenous carb oxidation, which we'd expect to see. So there was a slight limitation in that study. And then a study from our group in Leeds in the UK, led by Josh, who I mentioned earlier, for his PhD, looked at both the exogenous carbohydrate oxidation and also the effect then on liver and muscle glycogen, so the body's own endogenous stores of carbohydrate.
We should probably explain endogenous and exogenous to people before we get too deep.
So yeah, these terms, exogenous and endogenous carbohydrate oxidation that we use and you'll see in papers, means simply exogenous being from outside. So anything that is in the drink or the gel that you take and is burnt during your exercise, we're terming exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, and endogenous means relating to what's already in the body. So carbohydrate in the body is stored primarily in the liver and the muscle as glycogen.
Perfect, thank you.
Are you a triathlete sick of fumbling around in the dark with your nutrition? Is nutrition the missing link in helping you reach your goals? And do you want to maximise your training efforts and level up your performance? Of course you do! Come and join me for free at Fuel School. It's a free 3-day live and online nutrition training week. And I've designed it to give you the nutritional edge in 2024 and lay the foundation of your day-to-day fueling and race nutrition. It's on the 14th to the 16th of January, 9 a.m. Brisbane time, so Australian Eastern Standard Time every day, which is 3 p.m. PST, 5 p.m. CST and 6 p.m. EST on the 13th to the 15th of January. To register, head to fuel.school, www.fuel.school. Whether you're a seasoned triathlete or just starting your nutrition journey, this free event is your opportunity to learn from an advanced sports dietitian and triathlon nutrition specialist and transform the way you approach your nutrition for 2024. Fuel.school, it's free. I'll see you there.
Yeah, so Josh measured exogenous carbohydrate oxidation and liver and muscle glycogen and performance. And that was in a running study with pretty well-trained runners. And they did a 2-hour steady state protocol. So they just ran at about 70% of their VO2 max for 2 hours. Then they jumped off for a very quick rest and back on the treadmill for a 5K time trial. And that was the first study in the literature then that showed an increase in the amount of carbohydrate that was being burnt from the drink, so the exogenous oxidation. It also showed that performance was better as well. So they improved on the hydrogel. And again, this is compared to a control carbohydrate drink, so matched for dose, timing, type, composition, everything the same, just without the hydrogel. Whereas some of the previous studies have looked at the hydrogel, but say compared to water or placebo, which we know is going to improve generally, whether it's carb in a hydrogel or carb not in a hydrogel. You're taking it versus water, you should see an improvement.
So is Josh's the first study of its kind to do that, to test that endurance performance with a hydrogel matched with just a carbohydrate solution that's the same, but not in a hydrogel?
No, other studies had done that. It was the first to show that it worked. And why that is, I think, probably largely comes down to a combination of the running, the intensity of the running and the duration of the running. So the kind of longer and harder that people go, the more likely it is that fuel, i.e. carbohydrate as a fuel, is going to become a limiting factor. The harder that people are running, and again, the longer, the more likely we are to see gastrointestinal disturbances and complaints. And so you keep pushing that envelope further and further and people head into that zone of discomfort. You know, if you're running long distance tries or marathons or whatever, the longer you go on and the more you keep trying to eat and feed, the harder that seems to get. And so it might sort of just be a combination of those things, that the hydrogel just started to pinch a little bit of, gut comfort back and just make people a bit more happy, or that physiological mechanism was working where a little bit more over the 2.5 hours was just starting to slide through into the gut and really give that maximum opportunity for the gut to absorb it.
What pace were these guys running the 5K time trial in, just so we get a sense for how trained they are?
Ballpark 20 minutes. Some were a bit quicker, some were a bit slower.
So perhaps we haven't seen good quality research yet, but it could potentially be coming?
I think we might see more studies if they're thorough enough and use the kind of detailed measures that we used in that study, where we're getting So we put what's called an isotope tracer in the drink to try and work out what's happening to the carbs. It's basically like sticking a tag on the sugars and tracking it through the body. We can see it emerge in breath and in the blood, and we can do some pretty nifty maths with that and work out what's being burnt and what's being burnt where. So I think we need those measures to help us identify, and there's some other good measures we can look at to measure the gastric emptying and the absorption as well. So yeah, we might see that emerge. I'm certainly not writing off hydrogels, and largely that's because they're so popular, and there's still people absolutely swearing by Maurten and the product and saying, I just feel better and I feel quicker. And usually in sports nutrition, to me, that means something.
Yes, definitely not the cheapest way to fuel, but if you feel different and feel better, then it may be worth it. Think about like the original Coke and caffeine stuff, right? They were drinking Coke in Ironman in the 80s before we realised that caffeine was that useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, it's often the way that you get enough athletes, kind of wisdom of crowds thing, isn't it? You get enough athletes doing something and continuing to do it. It's usually not hype. There's usually something behind that. So it'd be remiss of us to just abandon hydrogels at this point and say, yeah, enough's enough, it doesn't work. I think it's way too early for that.
Yeah, excellent. Can I ask you what those carbohydrate oxidation rates were in that study?
So we saw, in that study, the exogenous carbohydrate oxidation was about 1.3 grams a minute. Obviously, that's an average across the participants. That's in pretty good agreement with the literature, really. That previous hydrogel study that I mentioned by Sean, that was almost identical exogenous rate as well. So we've seen higher in different carb studies, mostly in cycling, because really most of the studies are in cycling. We've seen as high as 1.7 grams per minute. So it's a lot of carbohydrate that you can potentially burn from your drink or your gel.
That's a lot. So 1.3 is 78 grams an hour.
Yeah.
And 1.7 grams is 102 grams of carbohydrate per hour. So very high carbohydrate rates.
Yeah, and I'm not sure really you'd be able to get it much higher than that from what we know about the ability of the intestine to handle and transport carbohydrate through the gut. You're only going to achieve that if you've got mixture of carbohydrate sources, glucose and fructose basically, and you're right up at the saturation point there. So where our understanding is of the gut's ability to absorb is about 100 grams per hour, and that's probably in someone who's got good guts and has got pretty well trained guts as well. So if you were to increase that to, say, 120 grams per hour, we don't think you really absorb any more than that. So that's about as high as you're going to get.
I think that's good for people to hear, because there's so much stuff in marketing messages and the media about more carbs. And age group athletes are hearing this message thinking, I'm going to fuel at 90 grams an hour. I'm going to go to 120 grams an hour. But really, they don't have the basics sorted of the right carbohydrate blends or enough carbohydrate in their day-to-day diet before they even start to take and look at these shiny objects like something like a hydrogel or increased fueling to be able to actually deal with it in the gut.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think if you haven't sorted the basics out and your diet's wrong, don't really even bother. Start there. It's the kind of classic pyramid of evidence base, isn't it? Start with the important stuff, what you're eating day to day, how you're fueling.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. I bang on about that all the time. Triathletes have no idea how to periodize their food to their training, but they love all the latest gadgets and tech and stuff. And I've had so many people lately come and tell me they're using Maurten for the hydrogel, or, they're trying to increase their fueling to 120 grams an hour. And I'm just like, you're an idiot. Step back to doing proper recovery nutrition 101 first, and we'll look at that once you've got the rest of that dialed in.
And the difference of what you can buy and spend an awful lot of money on in sports nutrition versus, I guarantee you've got a bag of sugar in your cupboard, you can go and make something that's about 80% of a representation with that and just make it in your water bottle. So is all that investment going to result in a lot? Physiologically, no. There's definitely a placebo effect, but once you keep using something, you're going to lose the placebo effect. So, time that well even as well.
So in summary, who would the hydrogel technology be useful for?
If you've tried it and you're somebody that knows that you've had gut issues and you get soreness or cramping or belching and wind during exercise, and you try the hydrogel and think you don't, you may as well stick with it. If you find something that works for you, then go with it. And that's kind of sports nutrition in a nutshell as well, isn't it? We're so different, and it's very difficult with nutrition to dial in who will respond to what until you actually give it a go. So that's probably the first category, and that applies to age groupers, elites, whoever you are. If you're an elite or pushing that elite boundary and you're just trying to sneak that really kind of high volume carbohydrate through, yes, the hydrogel might be something that works. We can sort of plug a recent study that we've just published as well in pretty well trained kind of top level marathoners. So we're looking at like 220 marathoners and some elite race walkers as well out of the AIS. And we didn't look at the fuel utilization rates in that study, but we used Maurten in the runners and they loved it. And we were seriously pushing the envelope on how much carb we could get in them diet and during their training and racing. Like we absolutely went for it with that study. And they had really almost no GI issues at all, either as symptoms and some measures we did of gastrointestinal disturbance, almost nothing there. So we know we can really ramp that carb up, but if you're not in that category and pushing 100 plus grams an hour during exercise and absolutely, like you said, periodizing your nutrition for race prep, I think just sticking with the normal carb strategies for training and racing would be more than enough.
So maybe don't waste your money on hydrogels unless you're at the top end of the spectrum and you're looking at doing a 9-hour marathon, a 9-hour Ironman, or you have gut issues and taking something like a hydrogel helps to alleviate that for you.
Yeah, I think so. And if you're in that latter category, there could be a myriad of reasons why you're struggling to absorb carbohydrate. At the end of the day, carbohydrate in sugar form is a very simple molecule. It shouldn't cause a huge amount of GI distress. So if you find yourself in that category, yeah, do a bit of self-experimentation, but find a good sports dietitian and go and start nutting out some of those problems, I think, as well.
Yeah, good advice. Thank you. Thanks for the shameless plug. I think people go to something like that first, though, but don't actually explore the types of carbohydrates they've got in their products or how much they're having per hour, or they're significantly under eating carbohydrate on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
And then try and hit these big carbohydrate per hour targets in a race and wonder why they end up vomiting on the run.
And something I've seen a lot of, and I try and talk about with most athletes, and I've talked about publicly, is a lot of people have fructose intolerance issues. Roughly, it would affect about 10% of the population. If you're someone who eats an apple and starts burping, you've probably got a fructose intolerance. And a lot of the carb products on the market, they tell you what the ingredients are, but unless you know exactly what you're looking for, you wouldn't necessarily know. So have a close look at the ingredients list. If it's got fructose in it, it will be sold probably as a mixture. If it's saying it can oxidize 90 grams or burn 90 grams an hour or 1.5 grams per minute, it'll have fructose in it. So if that is an issue for you, maybe wind back your fructose intake. Again, probably something I'd see a dietitian about or get down to your GP and talk about if that is a big issue for you. Like if it's just a bit of mild discomfort, then you're fine. I'm not sort of trying to alarm anyone, but trying to sort of nut that problem out to what you should and shouldn't eat, we start getting into medical territory. So it's definitely worth some advice if you're struggling big time with that.
Agree. One of the things we dive into inside the Triathlon Nutrition Academy is the types of carbohydrates that are in products and what you're looking for and how to read the label, because so much is disguised and masked by lots of weird marketing messages, isn't it? So understanding what's in your products is really important, and then also understanding the ratio of those, because we know that we need glucose to help transport fructose in a way, and just getting that balance right can sometimes help. But definitely seek professional advice if that's you, rather than just trying to wing it, because usually it's a quick, easy fix. It's just having an understanding of what the actual problem is first, rather than just trying to wing it by yourself or on Dr. Google for too long and fail forwards, but get some actual advice.
Yeah, I think that would work pretty well. And if you're having an issue with that, there's probably something underneath it. Not saying, like again, to alarm anyone, but you've probably got digestive issues somewhere else if you fall into that category. And again, it's a small percent of the population.
Okay, so Hydrogel 101, what's the bottom line?
Evidence to say to date so far, they don't work over other carbohydrate products. But if you want to give it a go and try and self-experiment and see if it makes any difference, because there is some good evidence out there to say that people enjoy using the products and do benefit from gastrointestinal symptoms.
Boom. So watch this space, I guess. Nothing to say really clearly that it is beneficial, but it doesn't mean that research is not necessarily coming. But like Andy said, test it out. If budget is a constraint for you, then I wouldn't be looking at products like Maurten or SAS Beta Fuel because they are the most expensive on the market. There are plenty of other ways to get fuel in a way more cost-effective way. And whether you need to go down the path of investing in the hydrogel stuff for you for performance, it's probably one of the last things that we would look at. We'd do a whole heap of other things first with your nutrition before going down that rabbit hole. All right, well, thank you so much for joining me, Andy. I definitely have really enjoyed picking your brain on hydrogel. I couldn't think of anyone better to talk about it. You are very much across all the things and I would just hash it. So thank you so much for giving us your insight into all the research in this space so far.
No worries, Taryn. Thanks for having me on.
Yoo-hoo!
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Triathlon Nutrition Academy podcast. I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions or want to share with me what you've learnt, email me at podcast@dietitianapproved.com. You could also spread the word by leaving me a review and taking a screenshot of you listening to the show. Don't forget to tag me on social media at dietitian.approved so I can give you a shout out too. If you want to learn more about what we do, head to dietitianapproved.com. And if you want to learn more about the Triathlon Nutrition Academy program, head to dietitianapproved.com/academy. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to helping you smash it in the fourth leg. Nutrition!